Canada just declared economic independence from the United States. I'm not exaggerating. What was announced today is the biggest geopolitical shift in North American history, and I've been digging through the details for hours, trying to understand the full scope of what this means. So here's what just happened. The Canadian Prime Minister just announced he's leaving for a massive trade mission, but this isn't your typical diplomatic visit. This is a full-scale pivot away from America. He's heading to India, Australia, and Japan for 12 days, and the goal is crystal clear: replace the United States as Canada's primary economic partner. Now, what I'm about to show you changes the whole picture, because this announcement came just hours after the U.S. Supreme Court struck down some of the tariffs that have been hammering Canadian exports. You'd think that would be good news, right? You'd think Canada would take a breath and try to negotiate with Washington. Instead, they doubled down on moving away from America entirely. Let me break down what's actually happening here, because the timeline tells you everything. For over a year now, the relationship between Canada and the United States has been in complete freefall. We're talking about a trade war that started with threats to make Canada the 51st state. I know that sounds insane, but that's literally what's been happening. The U.S. president has repeatedly said he wants Canada to become part of America. And when the Canadian government pushed back, he responded with tariffs. Massive tariffs. We're talking 25% on most goods, 35% on some sectors, and at one point threats of 100% tariffs if Canada made deals with China. And here's where it gets complicated. Canada didn't just sit there and take it. They went to China. In January, the Canadian Prime Minister flew to Beijing and signed a deal to lower tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles from 100% down to 6%. At the same time, China agreed to slash tariffs on Canadian canola oil. This was a direct middle finger to Washington, and the U.S. president went ballistic. He threatened 100% tariffs on all Canadian goods if that China deal went through. But that's not even the real story, because what nobody's talking about is how calculated this pivot has been. This isn't a panic move. This has been in the works for months. Last month at the World Economic Forum, the Canadian PM gave a speech that basically told the world that the old rules don't apply anymore. He said, "We're living in a rupture of the global order, and that middle powers like Canada need to stop waiting for superpowers to protect them and start building their own alliances." Wait, it gets worse, because the U.S. president heard that speech, and his response was to say, "Canada lives because of the United States." Think about that for a second. That's not diplomacy. That's a threat, and Canada heard it loud and clear. So now we're at today. The announcement just came out. Starting February 26th, the Canadian PM is going to Mumbai and New Delhi first. He's meeting with the Indian Prime Minister, and they're going to formalize negotiations on a massive trade deal. The goal, double trade between the two countries from $31 billion to $70 billion by 2030. That's a staggering number. India is the world's fastest growing major economy, and Canada wants in. Then he flies to Australia, and this is the part that kept me up last night. He's going to address both houses of Australia's parliament. This hasn't happened in 20 years. The last time a Canadian Prime Minister did this was back in 2006. Why does that matter? Because when you address a foreign parliament, you're not just making nice. You're signaling a strategic partnership. Australia has what Canada needs: critical minerals, advanced tech partnerships, and a shared interest in countering Chinese influence in the Pacific. But more importantly, Australia is looking for alternatives to relying solely on the United States too. And then Japan. The final stop is Tokyo. Clean energy partnerships, advanced manufacturing, food security deals. Japan is the world's fourth largest economy, and they're desperately trying to diversify away from Chinese supply chains. Canada has the resources Japan needs: uranium, rare earth minerals, agricultural products. Here's what nobody's talking about, though. All three of these countries, India, Australia, Japan, are part of what's being called the Indo-Pacific strategy. And guess who's not the main player in that strategy anymore? The United States, at least not in the way it used to be. This is the part where you need to understand the numbers. Right now, Canada exports about $600 billion worth of goods to the United States every year. That's roughly 75% of all Canadian exports. The Canadian government has set a goal to double non-U.S. exports to $600 billion over the next decade. Think about what that means. They're trying to build an entirely parallel economy that doesn't depend on America, and the U.S. knows this. That's why the tariffs have been so aggressive. That's why there's been talk of blocking the opening of a new bridge between Detroit and Windsor. The U.S. is trying to squeeze Canada back into dependence, but Canada is calling that bluff. Now, what I'm about to show you is why this matters to you, even if you don't live in Canada or the U.S., because this isn't just about trade numbers. This is about something much bigger. What's happening right now is a complete reorganization of global power, and Canada just became the test case for what happens when a country decides it doesn't want to be dependent on a superpower anymore. Let me show you exactly how this works. When the Canadian PM goes to India next week, he's not just signing papers. He's bringing a delegation of business leaders. We're talking energy companies, tech firms, mining corporations, and they're going there with specific objectives. India needs energy desperately. They're projected to need 70% more energy by 2040. Canada has natural gas, uranium, clean energy tech. India needs food security. Canada is one of the world's largest agricultural exporters, but here's where it gets complicated. India has been buying most of its oil from Russia. After the war in Ukraine started, India actually increased imports from Russia to 37% of all their oil, but those imports dropped 18% recently because of European sanctions. That created an opening, and Canada's walking right through it. Now, what I'm about to tell you changes the whole dynamic, because this isn't just about replacing Russian oil. This is about Canada positioning itself as the supplier for the entire developing world. India is the gateway. If Canada can lock in long-term energy contracts with India, they can use that as leverage with other Asian economies, Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand. All of these countries are looking to diversify away from Chinese and Russian suppliers. And then there's the tech angle. This is what people are missing. At the G20 summit last year, Canada, India, and Australia formed something called the AID Partnership. That's the Australia, Canada, India Technology and Innovation Partnership. What does that actually mean? It means they're pooling resources to develop artificial intelligence, nuclear energy tech, and critical mineral supply chains. And they're doing it without the United States. Let me pause here because I know what you're thinking. You're thinking this can't work. You're thinking Canada is too dependent on the U.S. to actually pull this off. And look, I get it. The numbers are brutal. Nearly $4 billion worth of goods crosses the U.S.-Canada border every single day. 60% of all U.S. crude oil imports come from Canada. 85% of U.S. electricity imports. Canada is the largest foreign supplier of steel, aluminum, and uranium to America. But that's not even the real story, because what nobody's talking about is that the dependence goes both ways. Canada is the top export destination for 36 U.S. states. 36. If Canada successfully diverts even 20% of its trade to Asia and Europe, those states are going to feel it hard. And a lot of those states are politically critical swing states. Here's what I found when I was digging into this. The U.S. president has threatened tariffs, but he's also been trying to block specific infrastructure projects. There's this bridge called the Gordie Howe International Bridge. It's been under construction for years. It's supposed to be the biggest crossing between the U.S. and Canada. And earlier this month, the U.S. president said he's going to delay the opening because he doesn't like the terms of the contract. He said Canada gets all the toll revenue, which isn't true, but facts don't seem to matter anymore. Wait, it gets worse, because this bridge was entirely funded and built by Canada. The U.S. didn't put a single dollar into it, but now they want to renegotiate the deal or block it from opening. Why? Because they know that bridge represents economic independence. It's a direct route for Canadian goods to reach ports on the East Coast and bypass traditional U.S.-controlled corridors. Now let me show you the Australia piece, because this is where the strategy gets really clear. When the Canadian PM addresses Australia's parliament, he's going to be talking about defense cooperation, but not the kind of defense cooperation you're thinking of. This is about maritime security in the Pacific. Australia has been building up its navy to counter Chinese expansion in the South China Sea. Canada wants in on that, not because they care that much about the South China Sea, but because being part of that alliance gives them leverage. Here's what's actually happening. Australia, Japan, South Korea, and increasingly Canada are forming what some analysts are calling the Quad Plus. It's a defense and economic alliance specifically designed to counter both Chinese aggression and American unpredictability. And yes, I said American unpredictability because what the last year has proven is that you can't rely on the United States to maintain stable relationships, even with its closest allies. And then there's the critical minerals component. This is huge. Australia has lithium, rare earths, cobalt. Canada has uranium, graphite, nickel. Together, they can control a significant portion of the global supply chain for batteries, nuclear energy, and advanced electronics. And they're deliberately cutting China out while also not making themselves dependent on U.S. processing facilities. This is the part that kept me up last night, because if Canada and Australia can lock down critical minerals and build their own processing infrastructure, they don't need America or China for the next generation of technology. They become the gatekeepers. But here's the problem, and it's a big one. This whole strategy depends on speed. The longer it takes to build these alternative relationships, the more leverage the U.S. has to crush them. And the U.S. knows this. That's why we're seeing escalating tariffs, infrastructure blockades, and increasingly hostile rhetoric. Now, what I'm about to show you is where Japan fits into this and why the timing of this trip is absolutely critical, because Japan is the missing piece that makes this entire strategy either brilliant or catastrophic. And I've been trying to figure out which one it is. Here's what you need to understand. Japan is in a really weird position right now. They've been America's closest ally in Asia for 80 years, but the current U.S. administration has made it clear that alliance doesn't mean what it used to mean. Japan watched as the U.S. threatened South Korea with tariffs unless they paid $350 billion for the privilege of keeping U.S. troops on their soil. Japan saw the U.S. try to coerce Canada into becoming the 51st state. And Japanese leadership is asking themselves a very reasonable question. Are we next? So when the Canadian PM lands in Tokyo, he's going to be walking into a country that's quietly terrified of what American foreign policy looks like now, and Canada is offering an alternative, not a replacement for the U.S.-Japan alliance, but a parallel structure that doesn't depend on American goodwill. Let me break down what's on the table. Japan needs food security. They import 60% of their food. Canada is offering long-term agricultural contracts. Japan needs energy. They're almost entirely dependent on imported natural gas and oil. Canada has liquefied natural gas infrastructure that can ship directly to Tokyo. Japan needs rare earth minerals for their tech industry. Canada and Australia can supply that. But here's where it gets complicated, because Japan is also deeply integrated into U.S. supply chains. Toyota, Sony, Hitachi, all of these companies have massive operations in the United States. If Japan pivots too hard toward this Canada-Australia alliance, the U.S. could retaliate with tariffs that would devastate Japanese exports. And this is where the gamble comes in. Canada is betting that by the time the U.S. realizes what's happening, it'll be too late to stop it. They're betting that India, Australia, and Japan can form a trading bloc that's large enough and powerful enough that the U.S. has to accept it as a reality. Now, what nobody's talking about is the timeline. This trip is happening February 26 to March 7. That's 12 days. But there's another date that matters even more, July 1st, 2026. That's when the USMCA, the trade agreement between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico, is up for review. And right now, nobody knows if it's going to be renewed. Think about what that means. If that agreement expires, the U.S. could impose tariffs on Canadian goods with no restrictions at all. We could be looking at 50, 60, 70% tariffs on everything from cars to maple syrup. The Canadian economy would be hit harder than it's been hit since the Great Depression. So Canada is in a race. They need to get these alternative trade deals locked in before July, because if July comes and the USMCA collapses, Canada needs to be able to turn to India, Australia, and Japan and say, we don't need America anymore. But here's the twist, and it's a big one. The U.S. knows this. The Supreme Court just struck down a bunch of the emergency tariffs the president was using. You'd think that would be good news for Canada, but instead the president immediately imposed a new 15% global tariff using a different law, and he's made it clear he's going to keep finding ways to punish Canada economically until they back down. Wait, it gets worse, because the president has also started targeting specific Canadian provinces. Ontario ran an ad in the US that used clips of Ronald Reagan criticizing tariffs. The president's response, he threatened to increase tariffs on Ontario by 10%. And then when the Canadian government announced their China deal, he threatened 100% tariffs on everything. This is not normal. This is economic warfare. And Canada is trying to fight back by building alliances faster than the US can tear them down. Now, let me show you the numbers that make this even more insane. Canada's goal is to double non-US exports to $600 billion by 2035. Right now, they're at about $300 billion. That means they need to find $300 billion worth of new trade over the next 9 years. To put that in perspective, that's roughly the entire GDP of Denmark. They need to build an economy the size of Denmark in less than a decade. And they're trying to do it while under active economic attack from the world's largest economy. Here's what I found when I was looking at the provincial responses. Ontario, which is Canada's largest province, has stopped buying American alcohol. They pulled every US wine, beer, and spirit from their liquor stores. Nova Scotia doubled the tolls for American trucks using their highways. British Columbia is reviewing all government contracts to eliminate purchases from US companies. These are not symbolic gestures. These are coordinated economic countermeasures. But here's the problem, and it's the biggest problem of all. Even with India, Australia, and Japan, even with new trade deals and diversification, Canada cannot replace $600 billion worth of exports to the United States in 9 years. It's not mathematically possible. The infrastructure doesn't exist. The shipping routes aren't built. The relationships aren't deep enough. So what's really happening here? Is Canada actually trying to replace the US as a trading partner, or are they trying to build enough leverage to force the US to negotiate? This is the part where I have to be honest with you. I don't know. I've been trying to figure this out for hours, and I genuinely don't know if this is a bluff or if Canada is serious about decoupling from the American economy. What I do know is this. The next 2 weeks are going to tell us everything. If the Canadian PM comes back from this trip with signed agreements in India, Australia, and Japan, we're looking at a fundamental reorganization of global trade. If he comes back with vague promises and photo ops, then this was all theater. But there's one more thing, and it's the thing that makes me think this is real. The Canadian government just announced a $70 billion investment deal with the United Arab Emirates. $70 billion. That's not a symbolic number. That's real money flowing into Canadian infrastructure, energy, and tech. And it's coming from a country that traditionally aligns with American interests. Now, what I'm about to show you is what happens next and why the outcome of this trip could reshape everything we thought we knew about North American relations. Because here's what nobody's prepared for. If Canada actually pulls this off, it changes the entire calculus of global power. And I mean that literally. Think about it this way. For the last 80 years, the entire Western alliance has been built on one assumption, that the United States is the irreplaceable center of the global economy, that if you're a democracy, if you believe in free trade and open markets, you have to align with Washington because there's no alternative. Canada is testing whether that's still true, and the answer they're about to get will determine the future of every middle power on the planet. Let me show you why this matters beyond just Canada. South Korea is watching this. They just paid $350 billion to keep US troops on their soil, and they're asking themselves if that was necessary or if they got extorted. The European Union is watching. They've seen the US threaten tariffs on them, threaten to pull out of NATO, threaten to abandon Ukraine. Every single US ally is doing the same calculation Canada is doing. Can we survive without America? And what Canada is trying to prove is that the answer is yes. Not easily, not without pain, but yes. Now, here's where it gets really interesting, because if Canada succeeds, you're going to see other countries try the same thing. Mexico is already looking at it. They've been hit with the same tariffs Canada has. They're part of the same threatened trade agreement, and Mexico has something Canada doesn't, a massive cheap labor force that could absorb a lot of manufacturing that's currently in China. If Mexico and Canada both successfully diversify away from the United States, NAFTA is dead. And if NAFTA is dead, the entire concept of North American economic integration collapses. We'd be looking at 3 separate economies instead of one integrated bloc. But here's the twist. The US might not actually care, because what I've been seeing in the rhetoric from Washington is that there's a faction that genuinely believes America doesn't need trading partners. They believe the US can just impose tariffs, force companies to build factories in America, and bring back the manufacturing economy of the 1950s. The problem is, that's not how modern economies work. You can't just will supply chains back into existence. You can't tariff your way to prosperity when your entire economy is built on importing cheap components and exporting high-value finished goods. But that economic reality hasn't stopped the political will, and that's what makes this so dangerous, because what we're watching is two completely different visions of how the world should work, and they're on a collision course. Let me break down the actual endgame scenarios here, because there are really only three ways this plays out. Scenario one, Canada's bluff gets called. They go on this trade mission, they get some preliminary agreements, but when it comes time to actually implement them, the numbers don't work. The US maintains enough economic leverage that Canadian businesses can't afford to shift away. The alternative markets aren't large enough or profitable enough, and Canada quietly backs down, negotiates a new trade deal with the US, and accepts whatever terms they can get. In this scenario, the US wins, but the relationship is permanently damaged. Canada becomes a reluctant dependent rather than a willing partner. Scenario two, Canada succeeds, but slowly. They build out these alternative relationships over the next decade. Trade with India, Australia, and Japan grows, but not fast enough to replace the US. We end up in a hybrid situation where Canada is diversified enough that they can't be completely coerced, but not independent enough to tell the US to back off entirely. This is probably the most realistic scenario, but it's also the most unstable, because you'd have ongoing tension, ongoing tariff battles, and no clear winner. Scenario three, this escalates into a full economic war. The US imposes massive tariffs. Canada retaliates by cutting off critical resources. We're talking oil, electricity, uranium. The US has to find alternative suppliers, which takes years and costs hundreds of billions. Canada's economy takes a massive hit in the short term, but emerges more independent in the long term. This is the worst-case scenario for both countries, but it's not impossible. In fact, with the way things are going, it might be more likely than people think. And here's what terrifies me about scenario three, because if that happens, it doesn't just hurt the US and Canada, it destabilizes the entire global economy. Supply chains collapse, energy markets spike, food prices go up, and every other country has to choose sides. Now, what I'm about to tell you is where I think this is actually heading, and I could be completely wrong, but here's my read. I think Canada is serious. I think they've looked at the last year of chaos and threats and decided that betting their entire economy on American stability is too risky. I think they're willing to take short-term economic pain to build long-term independence. But I also think they're hoping they don't have to. I think the real goal here is to build enough leverage that when the USMCA comes up for review in July, Canada can walk into those negotiations and say, we don't need this deal as badly as you think we do. And if that works, if the US blinks and offers reasonable terms, then everybody wins. The trade relationship continues, but on more balanced terms. Canada gets the security of diversified trading partners, and the US keeps its largest trading partner. But if the US doesn't blink, if they double down on tariffs and threats, then we're in uncharted territory, because Canada will have to decide if they're willing to go through with this pivot entirely. And that's a decision that will define North American relations for the next 50 years. So here's where we are. In 3 days, the Canadian Prime Minister gets on a plane. 12 days later, we'll have a much better idea of whether this is real or theater. And by July, we'll know if the North American alliance survives or if we're watching it collapse in real time. I'm curious what you think about this. Does Canada have any real chance of pulling this off, or is this just a negotiating tactic that's going to backfire? Let me know in the comments, because I genuinely want to hear different perspectives on